Great. Well, welcome back. Just a reminder, two reminders. This is our last meeting. We need all work in by the 15th of December. And fill out the course evaluations, which you can find on the course website. They're very useful to us in determining what went right, what could have been done better, and how to improve. And so there was something else I was going to tell everyone. Yeah, so remember, final papers, I need everything by the 15th. Send it to me by email and or bring it to me in person, put it in the mail, so that we can get the grades in. And if you're interested in finding out what happens after this particular period we're talking about, you'll have to come back in the fall of next year when I plan to be offering the second half of American constitutional history, which will cover what happens after we conclude tonight. So, hate to leave you hanging. Okay. Now, last time we ended by talking about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which Stephen A. Douglas proposed in January of 1854. And as I said, Senator Douglas's only intention was to build a railroad across the continent. And to do that, he needed a territorial government established in the Kansas Territory. And in order to have a government established there, he needed the approval of Senator Davy Atchison of Missouri. Atchison would not approve the creation of a territorial government because, as you'll recall, the Kansas Territory, the Nebraska Territory, as it was called, was north of the 3630 line, and thus would be a free territory, would become a free state, and Atchison did not want a free state on the border of Missouri. And so Douglas, in order to appease Senator Atchison, in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, divided this territory, establishing the northern boundary of Kansas, roughly where the northern boundary of Kansas is today, and saying, in this part of the Nebraska Territory, or of this remaining territory, the Missouri Compromise was no longer in effect. It was void. The people of the territory could determine whether or not they would allow slavery. The rest of the territory would continue to be free territory. Bless you. And Douglas realized when he introduced this bill that this was going to cause major problems. He said he could walk home from Washington to Chicago by the light of his own effigies. The Kansas-Nebraska Act passed quite narrowly, actually, and it did set off a major outrage. This was one of only 3 pieces of legislation Congress passed or considered during the 1854 session. 44 of the Northern Democrats, incidentally, were evenly divided over the Nebraska bill, as it was called. 44 voted for it, 44 voted against it. 1854 was an election year, and as you probably have gathered, Congress doesn't like to take up really contentious pieces of legislation in election years. And of the Democrats who voted for the bill from the North, only 7 were reelected. The rest lost their seats. All in all, 66 of 91 Democrats in the House lost their seats. So, big loss for the Democrats in the North. More importantly, this kills what was left of the Whig Party. You know, the Whigs had held on in the South. Now they're pretty much eliminated, as you can't get elected if you're a Whig because the Whigs had opposed the Nebraska bill and had said okay to allowing California in as a free state, doing all of these things for the good of the Union. You know, go home and tell your constituents you're doing something for the good of the Union. Often it doesn't go very well for you. So the Whigs collapse in the South, become Democrats. In the North, it's a little more complicated. I mentioned last time the Know-Nothings, but also a couple of other parties form. The Free Soil Party, which wants to maintain free soil in the federal territories. Not necessarily because they didn't like the institution of slavery, but because they thought the institution of slavery would prevent free white laborers from moving into these territories. And, you know, the Free Soilers were explicitly against the spread of slavery. The Know-Nothings had no position on the issue of slavery. They said our real problem are all these Catholics coming in from God knows where. And as I think I mentioned, in 1854, the Know-Nothings swept the elections in Massachusetts and actually controlled the state for a year or two. So there's that movement. There's also a Republican Party that emerges from all of this. And they take their name from the party of Jefferson and Madison. Jefferson and Madison created the Union, but also had this idea that slavery was wrong and it should be stopped from spreading, referring back to the principles of Jefferson and Madison. Remember, this is a very important thing because, of course, the Democrats traced their lineage to Jefferson. And you hear of another party, they're not saying, we're the descendants of Hamilton. No, they say, we're the real descendants of Jefferson. And remember, too, in this period, most abolitionists didn't vote because they thought the whole system was corrupt, and if you vote, you're complicit in this conspiracy or covenant with death, as I think William Lloyd Garrison called it. So you have this issue of Kansas and Nebraska, the Kansas and Nebraska Act, setting off this national political realignment. Now you also have, in 1854, very visible demonstration of, the effectiveness of part of the Compromise of 1850, and that is the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. And let me just say, the Fugitive Slave Law was overwhelmingly successful in recovering fugitives. Some 332 fugitive slaves were apprehended. And the way the law worked was this. I don't know if I went into a whole lot of detail. You recall in Prigg versus Pennsylvania, the court had said, yes, fugitives have to be delivered up, and states really ought to do this. Doesn't give any real enforcement mechanism here. The Fugitive Slave Law makes this a federal responsibility to ensure the return of fugitive slaves. And what would happen is a fugitive would be apprehended, would be taken before a magistrate. The magistrate then would determine whether or not this person was a fugitive slave. In Henry Clay's original bill, which didn't pass, the fugitive actually would be taken back to the place from which he or she had escaped and be given a trial by a jury. Clay believed this would be a safeguard for the fugitive if the fugitive turned out not to be a fugitive after all. The revised bill does not have this jury trial mechanism, but instead says magistrates will have to hear these cases and determine whether or not this person is a fugitive. And the way the bill worked, too, if you're a magistrate, you hear one of these cases, you determine that this person is not a fugitive, you get a fee of $5. If you determine the person is a fugitive, your fee is $10 because that requires more paperwork. Not that a federal magistrate would be swayed by, an additional $5, but, people say all kinds of outrageous things. Now, so of 332 fugitives, 300 were returned to their owners. These, though, became very visible and often violent encounters. For example, in Boston in 1851, a man named Shadrach Minkins was apprehended. And at this time, the north slope of Beacon Hill was the center of the black community in Boston, also the center of the abolition movement in the United States. Very well organized community, and Shadrach Minkins had made his way to Boston, was living in Boston, had been in Boston for a while, and then was apprehended as a fugitive slave, and was being held in the courthouse on Court Street, where the where the school department building is now. And in September of 1851, while he was being held, awaiting his rendition back to slavery, a group from the black community in Boston rescued him, a group called the Vigilance Committee, led by a man named Lewis Hayden. And Hayden and his wife were both escaped slaves from Kentucky, or they both had escaped from Kentucky and had become free, were living in Boston, and Hayden really is the leader of the abolition movement in Boston. And he organizes this storming of the courthouse, the freeing of Shadrach Minkins, and then the spiriting away of him to Canada. And this stuns the magistrates and others in Boston. We'll see this in a minute. In September of 1851, shortly after this, a slave is apprehended in Christiana, Pennsylvania, and his rendition sparks a riot in Christiana, with deaths. Actually, the rioters are charged with treason because they're using armed force against the authority of the law of the United States. Very interesting, complicated case. Anyway, in May of 1854, so just at the time, we're having this big debate about whether or not there will be slavery in these additional territories. A slave or a fugitive named Anthony Burns is apprehended in Boston, again on the north slope of Beacon Hill, and Burns has become a member of the 12th Baptist Church, and he is taken to the courthouse. And because the authorities recognize how badly things went with the rescue of Shadrach Minkins, they want to make sure they demonstrate that the law will be enforced even in Boston, where you have this high-profile, successful rescue of Shadrach Minkins. And so the militia is called out, is federalized actually, in support of the marshals who are going to escort Anthony Burns from the courthouse back to the dock. The magistrate in the case, I'm blanking on his name. I think his name might have been Lowell, but I could be wrong, and I don't want to malign any of the Lowells. Determines that Burns is a fugitive slave, actually belongs to someone in Virginia, so he has to be returned. And because the Vigilance Committee cannot get through into the courthouse, it's still there. It's surrounding the courthouse, and is going to cause trouble when Burns is brought out of the courthouse, which he has to be, and is taken down Long Wharf to put on board a ship. It's not a simple thing to do. You're transferring a prisoner, and there's a great opposition to the transference of this particular prisoner. So the militia is called out, and in the ensuing riot, Burns is taken to a ship. The owners of Long Wharf are afraid that this mob is going to damage Long Wharf, so he's actually not taken to Long Wharf. He's taken to T Wharf, put aboard a steamship called the Tyler. But in doing this, one federal marshal is killed, and the whole operation costs the federal government about $100,000. But it proves that the fugitive slave law can be enforced even in Boston, as Anthony Burns is marched past the old State House, within sight of Faneuil Hall. People have their flags flying upside down as a symbol of distress, and black crepe hanging from the buildings. It's really a calamity, the rendition of Anthony Burns, sending him back to slavery. Yes, Josh? Yes.
Whereas $5 would suffice for
$5 he would have been free, yeah. But you're demonstrating that you can enforce the law. And at what price do you say, well, that's too much to pay to enforce the law? And you also have developing an idea here. This is one of the things that fuels the rise of the Republican Party. I mentioned last time when I was talking about the press and the gag order on John Quincy Adams. Is slavery a local institution, or does it require the cooperation of everybody? Is it possible to have a localized institution like this, or does the institution of slavery require, someone like Anthony Burns being sent back, and you, good folks in Massachusetts, being complicit in this whole thing? I don't know. What price do you say is enough to enforce the law? Yeah, okay. It is a large sum of money. It was a large sum of money. Yeah, it was even larger then, I think. Okay. Actually, here's another little sidebar on this. The militia unit that escorts Anthony Burns back are the Columbia Guards, which is an Irish unit. That is, they're Irish immigrants. And after this, in 1854, as I mentioned, the Know-Nothings become the government of Massachusetts. They hate the Irish, so they pass a bill that says Irish can't carry weapons. So the Columbia Guards actually are disarmed as a result of this. Of course, the abolitionists are all for this, because these are the guys who got Anthony Burns back, and the know-nothings are all for this. So there's actually a statue on the public garden of the leader of the Columbia Guards. His name was Thomas Cass, and during the Civil War, he formed a regiment, an Irish regiment, the Irish Ninth, which fought in Virginia, fought throughout the war, and he actually died in the Civil War. And very interesting, recently published edition of the letters of some of the officers in the Irish Ninth, talking about being based on Robert E. Lee's plantation in Virginia and talking to the slaves there and realizing that the destinies of these two people, the Irish and the African Americans, were intertwined. It's a complicated story. Anyway, any other questions on this? Didn't mean to get sidetracked. And it's in the midst of this that you have Senator Douglas proposing the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And back in Kansas, we'll turn our attention away from Boston briefly. Well, not briefly. What happens in Kansas? Now we know that it's going to be the people in the Kansas Territory who decide whether or not Kansas will be a free state or a slave state. So I think you can predict what's going to happen. People who want the institution of slavery in Kansas are going to move to Kansas so they can vote, right? And introduce slavery into the territory. People who don't want the institution of slavery in Kansas are also going to move to Kansas so they can vote, saying we don't want slavery in Kansas. And each group is going to get support from various folks interested in one side or another. For example, lots of slave owners from Missouri go across the border into Kansas and, start setting up farms and towns and other things. And in response to this, and also because they want to it is in response to this, that groups like the New England Emigrant Aid Society form. This is kind of an irony. New Englanders hated immigrants, that is, people coming in, but they form a society for emigrants, people going out. And they sponsor settlements of anti-slavery folks in Kansas. And the two sides set up different towns. I mean, they don't all move to the same town. They set up different towns. So the pro-slavery folks have towns with names like Lecompton. We'll talk more about that. And the anti-slavery folks have towns with names like, one of the big funders of this is the Lawrence family. Same folks who helped set up the city of Lawrence. And so Lawrence. Another group from New York set up Manhattan. Have these names out there. Topeka, local name. And what happens when these two groups get out there actually is predictable. They start fighting with each other. The group of the pro-slavery folks burn the town of Lawrence. The Lawrence group, or the Free Soilers, as they will be called, then go and attack Lecompton. A real madman named John Brown. And incidentally, there's kind of a controversy about John Brown, madman or freedom fighter. Anyone have strong opinions on John Brown? I mean, I agree that slavery was a bad thing, but I do see Brown as a madman. And I think if he walked into the room and started talking to us, many of you would agree. But, I mean, who are we to judge? Trying to be dispassionate. And God had told him to go to Kansas, and he does. And God tells him to start killing the slave owners, which he does. Places like Potawatomi, there's a settlement of pro-slavery folks, and Brown and his sons killed them. Brown does look like an Old Testament prophet, the big white beard, and he's supported by folks in Boston, abolitionists in Boston. Julia Ward Howe remembers Brown coming to the door in their house in South Boston. Julia Ward Howe's husband ran the Perkins School for the Blind, and this guy, very serious, he has this. Anyway, Brown is really upset that the Massachusetts legislature doesn't give him financial support. So he turns to a group of others who do arm him and so on. Well, Brown comes back into the story in 1859. But anyway, what you have happening in Kansas then, pro-slavery, anti-slavery forces fighting it out, as each one is trying to establish a government in Kansas. The Free Soilers meet in Topeka and draw up a constitution that will prohibit slavery in the territory. The pro-slavery folks meet at Lecompton, and they draw up a constitution which will allow slavery. But the pro-slavery folks also see, people are going to vote on this, so we do want popular sovereignty, so they actually submit to the public two constitutions. That is, one constitution has slavery in it, and then there is the same constitution, same structure of government, but a prohibition on slavery. So if they anticipate people will want to vote on this with or without slavery. Okay, in December of 1857, should also point out, they're going to have separate referendums. You're not going to go to the polls and say, okay, here we have three choices, Lecompton with slavery, Lecompton without slavery, or Topeka. So two separate referenda. And the Free Soilers are going to boycott the Lecompton Constitution altogether. The pro-slavery folks are going to boycott the Topeka referendum altogether. Because they think each side thinks the other is completely illegitimate. It's kind of like what happened in Rhode Island with the Dorr War. So, December of 1857, there is a referendum, and 6,226 people vote for the Lecompton Constitution with slavery. 569 vote for it without slavery. Okay? So, means Lecompton Constitution, there will be slavery in Kansas. 2 weeks later, on January 4th, 1858, the Free Soilers have a referendum, and this time 138 people vote for the Constitution with slavery. 24 vote for it without slavery, and then 10,226 vote against the whole thing. So, what is the government in Kansas? It is a big headache, yeah, okay. President Buchanan says, this really wasn't an authorized referendum. This one actually had a constitution they were proposing. This one's just voting against this constitution. Who were these people? And Buchanan says the Lecompton Constitution actually is the legitimate government of Kansas. Yes?
Is there an actual ballot to vote against the whole thing?
Yeah, this is the vote against the whole thing this time. There wasn't here saying, hey, vote against the whole thing.
It was either or.
It was either with slavery, without slavery. This is with slavery, without slavery, start over. Which one?
For the handout.
Yeah, this is the Topeka group.
Okay, so on the Topeka Constitution.
Excuse me?
Who raised the flag and gave three options?
Excuse me?
I'm saying who gave the options of three?
Who gave the options? The Topeka crowd, the Free Soilers.
Okay.
Okay, so they're organizing this referendum. The pro-slavery people are organizing this referendum. Okay? And as I said, each is boycotting the other. Yes?
But 10,000 people must have not liked something in it other than the issue of slavery.
Well, maybe. Could very well be. But the main issue we see is it's the issue. They don't like the whole fact that these pro-slavery people are writing a constitution, and they're going to become the governing force. Incidentally, you can kind of figure out how the story ends ultimately if you know what the capital of Kansas is now. Okay? But it's not an easy decision. As I said, President Buchanan says, this is the legitimate government of Kansas. These folks should be able to form a constitution. And then Kansas can become a state, a slave state. Okay? And so he says we should accept the constitution they have proposed. And also the United States Senate says, let's accept this constitution. This should be the legitimate government of Kansas. The House of Representatives said, this isn't the legitimate government of Kansas. The Constitution these people are going to come up with is the legitimate government of Kansas. Who decides which is the government of Kansas? What role does the Senate have? What role does the House have or the President have in all of this? Excuse me? Well, does the Congress need to approve a state's constitution? The United?
No, but for recognition or for admittance to the Union and without admittance to the Constitution.
Well, how do we know if someone has been admitted to the Union as far as Congress is concerned? They send a representative to Congress, the House of Representatives in this case. Someone from Kansas shows up, elected by this crowd. The House of Representatives said, no, you're not allowed in here. Someone shows up from this crowd, the Senate won't let them in. So that's really the issue, and this is how Congress has a role in this. So no one, Kansas, the president has said Kansas is now a state. The Senate says Kansas is now a state. But the House of Representatives won't let them in, won't let presidential electoral votes be counted. And they say, it's a territory. It doesn't really have a government yet because they can't agree on what the government is. And what happens then is a civil war continues in Kansas over the next 4 years, as there isn't really a government, and the big issue is whether or not there will be slavery in Kansas, and then which is the legitimate government. Now, let me just go back for a minute to our old friend Stephen A. Douglas, who started all of this by saying, we'll let the people in Kansas decide. Douglas was not perfect. He could count, though. He said he wanted the people of Kansas to decide. See, a lot more people are on this side, so Douglas says, okay, the people of Kansas do not want slavery in the territory. So Douglas breaks with the Democrats, including the president, who was a Democrat, James Buchanan of Pennsylvania, and says popular sovereignty means the people get to decide. And in this case, this is what they have decided. Buchanan, I think, really wanted Kansas to decide it wanted slavery. He had this he saw the Democratic Party as being the only group that would defend the institution of slavery. He saw all Christendom is united against chattel slavery. It is united against the South. We will support them in this. So he wants to preserve this alliance between the Democrats of the North and the Democrats of the South. So this is what's happening in the late 1850s. You have this whole issue of Kansas, slavery in the territories, what happens when the territories become states. Okay, any other questions on this? Or observations? Yes?
Couldn't they just declare another election?
I suppose they could have, but these guys say, hey, we had an election and we won. I mean, how likely is it that you think you've won an election, you're going to say, okay, let's have another one? Because, you also can count. There are a lot more people who are going to vote against you next time. These folks will say, yes, let's have another election, definitely, because they know they're going to win. Okay? So that's really the issue here. One of the issues here is a very good question. Why not just have another referendum? Well, any other thoughts on this? Out of this impasse. Incidentally, this is a subject of great scholarly inquiry, probably not as much now as it was maybe 20 years ago. What brought on the Civil War? And there was this idea that, everything had gone along pretty smoothly before. Must be, in fact, one theory advanced was this was a blundering generation that couldn't quite get it right. I don't know how you can make that argument. I don't know. I'm still baffled by the Civil War. But, James Madison thought this was going to happen ultimately because of the question of slavery and the division over slavery. And others in the time are seeing a break may be coming. The people to blame are the abolitionists. Yes?
But the 10,000 at Topeka, they just voted against the whole thing.
The whole thing, yeah. Why? You think they...
They voted against slavery, yes?
Well, yeah, but against this whole Constitution. That's what's sticking you. There must have been something else other than slavery.
I can't quite figure out what they were...
Well, slavery becomes a big issue. It is the issue, but this may be a little misleading because, then we do see there are other things happening. Buchanan sends troops to Utah to put down the Mormons during the same period, and other issues happening. But this, yes, Massachusetts is the first state to abolish slavery. You want to say that again? I think by law we're supposed to say that several times over the course.
It actually wasn't an actual government, it was actually a jury.
It was a jury, yeah.
And so as being part of the Union, wouldn't other states follow that same route?
Some did. You know, actually, Massachusetts is the only one where it happened in a court. In others, it happened through gradual emancipation laws the legislature passed. But actually, you're onto something. Because when James Buchanan took office in March of 1857, he saw a way to resolve this whole problem. Franklin Pierce, incidentally, if anyone here is from New Hampshire, I think we should also mention Franklin Pierce was from New Hampshire and was also a Democrat, and also, like Buchanan, thought, we should protect the interests of slave owners. And in his farewell message, Pierce blasted the abolitionists and the free soilers for causing all of this trouble. And he said, the free soil, essentially, in 1856, the Republicans had nominated a candidate for president, and he lost, John Charles Fremont, and Pierce blasted this sectional party that only appeals to one part of the country, and also these abolitionists who are agitating to exclude slaves from the territories. Why should you infringe on the rights of a slave owner to bring his property into federal territories? And how can you discriminate against people like that because they happen to own a kind of property that you don't like? You say they can't go into Kansas or these other territories. So I don't know. It's you're onto something though, saying Buchanan sees a way to settle this whole thing. This is what happens when we try to let the people decide this. Okay, the states. Well, we kind of know how the free states are going to vote on this, but Buchanan knows there is a Supreme Court case making its way through the system that'll solve this very issue. And in his inaugural address on March the 4th, he says, happily for us, there's been this big controversy over slavery in the territories. Happily for us, the Supreme Court is going to rule on this very question, and once it does, we will all agree that this is what the Constitution says. Buchanan kind of knew how the court was going to rule, but nonetheless, he does hope. Yes?
Did he actually think the other side would just...
Well, sure. It's when the court speaks, this is what the Constitution says, right? And we all will cheerfully abide by the law. As John Marshall had said, it is emphatically the province and duty of the court to say what the law is. So now you have a chance for the court to say what the law is, because that's been the big issue. Can slavery be prohibited in the territories? Well, in 1820 we said yes. Now we're saying, we'll let the people decide. And actually the real pro-slavery people are saying Congress shouldn't be deciding this at all, because Congress is a body with limited powers, and its power over the territories is not a complete power. It's power to decide how the land will be sold and that kind of thing. If you'll remember, that was precisely what Senator Hayne had said back in 1830, when there was a big discussion about Congress selling land in the territories. And Hayne had said, well, wait a minute. We don't have that jurisdiction because the territories belong to each of the states. Well, if these territories belong to each of the states, how can the property of people in some of the states be kept out? Right? So, big, complicated issue. We will let the court decide. And that's what the court does in 1857. I'll give you some background on this. Actually, not many people had paid attention to this case as it was making its way through the lower courts. And, you don't see anything about it in the anti-slavery press, about this big case coming up that's going to decide everything. You don't really see a whole lot in the pro-slavery press either about this case. It goes something like this. A man named, there are two parties to the case, Dred Scott and his wife Harriet Scott. And both of them were born in Virginia, but both of them made their way to Minnesota through different ways. Dred Scott had been born in Virginia along about 1802, and he had been taken by his owners to Missouri. His owners owned a hotel in St. Louis, and they owned 6 slaves altogether, including Dred Scott, and they sold him to a Dr. John Emerson when he was about 31 years old. Dr. Emerson worked for the United States Army. That is, he's an Army doctor. And the Army sent him to Fort Armstrong, Illinois, and then in 1836 to Fort Snelling, Minnesota. Fort Snelling is now St. Paul, Minnesota. Okay? While he is in Minnesota, he meets Harriet Robinson, who also had been born in Virginia. Her owner, she was owned by a man named, I'm blanking on his name. This guy marries a woman from Pennsylvania, and his job, he's an Indian agent. That is, an agent for the United States government sent out to keep peace with the Sioux. So Harriet Robinson is taken by her owner, Tolliver. Taken by Mr. Tolliver, an Indian agent, out to Fort Snelling, where he is the agent to the Sioux. Okay. While there, she meets Dred Scott. They get married. They have 2 daughters. And then in the late 1830s, well, actually, it gets more complicated first. Dr. Emerson also gets married. I don't know if you need to write all of this down. You know, suddenly it sounds like a soap opera. All these folks out it sounds like Big House on the Prairie now, I think. Dr. Emerson marries a woman named Eliza Sanford. Okay. Her brother was an agent for the American Fur Company, which is why he's out there, you know, his agent for the fur company. They also have an interest among the Sioux in getting furs. And so Harriet Robinson, Dred Scott's owner, marries Eliza Sanford in 1838, and then Dr. Emerson dies in 1843. Okay. Any questions on this? Anyone want to figure out, more about? Yes.
How did marriages between slaves work when they worked in slaves?
That's a very good question. How did marriages between slaves work? Often they weren't formally recorded. Actually, there is a new book out about Mrs. Scott, a fascinating book. Let me just recommend it to you. And let me just say, I would know a lot more about the case had I read this book before. Mrs. Dred Scott, so I recommend it just to find out what's happening. A law professor out in Iowa has written this. Karen, did you know about this book? Okay. Leah Vandervelde. Okay. Law professor, which means she's really interested in the legal aspects of all of this. Okay. So when, bless you, Dr. Emerson dies, he makes his brother-in-law, John Sanford, the executor of his estate. And by this time, the Scotts actually have moved back to St. Louis. Okay, so they're in St. Louis. And Dred Scott is hired out. Dred and Harriet are both hired out by Mrs. Emerson to a variety of folks who put them to work. And this happened often, particularly in cities, if a slave would be hired out to someone else, and then they would give their wages back to their owner. You may recall the Quack Walker case. This is how Nathaniel Jennison, got into trouble because he wanted Quack Walker to pay him, and Quack Walker wasn't punctual enough. So in cities, slaves did have more leeway to hire themselves out, usually having to pay their owners back. But as Frederick Douglass said, a slave in a city is already half free. They have more mobility and so on. And so the Scotts now, living in St. Louis, are hired out, and whoever hires them sends whatever he is owed to Mrs. Sanford. And Mrs. Sanford, incidentally, John Sanford, the executor of the estate, doesn't live in St. Louis. He lives in New York. Mrs. Sanford lives in Massachusetts. But they own these slaves in St. Louis who are hired out and do work. And other than that, neither Sanford has much to do with them. So here they are in St. Louis, hired out. I guess they're given something to survive on while they're out there, but these owners in some distant locale are making out on this. Okay. The Scots, in April of 1846, go to court and sue for their freedom. And their argument is, we lived on free soil for about 10 years. We lived Dred Scott lived in Illinois and then in Minnesota. And under the laws of Illinois, slavery was prohibited. And under the Missouri Compromise of 1820, slavery was prohibited in the Minnesota Territory, which was part of the territory north of the 3630 line. And Harriet Scott had lived in Minnesota. Yes?
Why didn't they sue when they were still in Minnesota?
Well, that's a very good question. Why didn't they sue while they were still in Minnesota? Don't know. Maybe they could have. I don't think there really weren't strong territorial courts there, and what reason would they have? I mean, they're living in Minnesota, and it's not until they get back, and actually a while after they get back, that they bring this suit. It's one of these great questions. Why didn't they bring suit earlier? And their case is they had lived on free soil, and one of the legal principles that goes back to the Somerset case of 1772 is that a person who is set foot on free soil cannot be returned to slavery against his will. Okay? So, we lived on free soil, we have been returned here, and now we're wrongfully enslaved. It's a wrongful imprisonment suit or a wrongful enslavement suit. And it's a very strong case. Missouri courts had heard lots of cases like this. Your owner takes you to some other place, and then, and it's most states, I should point out, had laws for sojourners. For example, in New York, slave owners could bring their slaves to New York, even though slavery was against the law in New York, and while they were there, the person would still be a slave. That is, the status doesn't change if you're the lawful property of someone else. Or they may have a law about how long a slave can be in free territory before he can be sold, or how long he can stay. You may recall that passage in Huckleberry Finn where Pap is outraged because he goes into town and there is a college professor wearing the whitest shirt you ever saw, and he's carrying a gold-headed cane. And they say he's a college professor, and he can speak 6 languages, and he's just wonderful. And they say he can vote, too. And then Pap says, it was election day, so I said I would go vote. But they said I couldn't vote because I hadn't paid my poll tax. Pap, of course, when he's saying this, is filthy drunk, and he's wearing rags. And he said, I said I'd never vote again if they let this nigger vote. A lying, thieving, pilfering nigger vote, and I can't vote. Where are my rights in this? And he said, and then I said, well, why don't they sell him? And they said they couldn't sell him until he'd been in the state 6 months. Can you imagine that? They call this a government, too. They say they can't take this guy, this lying, thieving, pilfering nigger, and sell him. And then he passes out drunk, right? So this is the law that after 6 months, this guy, college professor, speaks 6 languages, either has to leave Missouri or be sold. And in other jurisdictions like New York, you could keep your property there for 6 months and still hold them as slaves. They didn't have a law like this in the Minnesota Territory. They simply had the Missouri Compromise of 1820 that said slavery doesn't exist here. And in Illinois, slavery was prohibited here. So the courts in Missouri had heard cases like this before, and invariably they ruled for the wrongfully enslaved person, because that's the law. The law says if you're held on free territory, you're free. So the Scots have a very strong case, but they lose it on a technicality because they brought suit against Mrs. Emerson when the court says, well, it's not clear if you're actually owned by Mrs. Emerson or if you're owned by her brother, John Sanford. So they appeal the case, and in 1850, the Missouri courts say, you're free. Okay? That under the law, the Scots are free. But then Mrs. Emerson appeals to the Missouri Supreme Court and finds a different atmosphere in Missouri in the 1850s than there had been in the 1840s. Why don't we take a break at this point, and when we come back, we'll find out what happens to the Scots.